So we are here at Gagosian, Grosvenor Hill, on the occasion of Helen Frankenthaler Imagining Landscapes, a fantastic exhibition that brings together 13 paintings between the years of 1952 to 1976. It's an honour to be here with you, Eleanor and Matthew, to discuss this incredible artist's life and career. And I'd love to first of all talk to you about the exhibition. We've just seen it downstairs. Tell me about paintings that have particularly struck you. Eleanor?
Well, I mean, for me, first of all, it's just so exciting to be in a space where we can see this number of her paintings. You know, it is amazing to think that there have been a number of displays, the Tate display, a number of smaller gallery presentations, but we haven't had a sizable Helen Frankenthaler show in the UK since 1969. So it's incredibly overdue, and these are paintings that just can't really reproduce. So to be able to stand in the midst of them and really commune with this painting is just incredibly exciting. So picking one is really difficult.
Yeah, absolutely. No, it's fascinating also, especially in this exhibition, to see that trajectory, as well as you highlight, we've got the Tate presentation on at the moment, and to see the works from the 50s and 60s there as well, complementing this. And then the woodblock exhibition at Dulwich, which is going to be fascinating to see an added layer to her later career. But Matthew, which were the works that stood out for you today in the exhibition?
Well, I was really interested as I was walking around the exhibition earlier, looking at the titles, and there was one that really struck me, Narcissus, from 1963, which is on unprimed canvas. And I was really interested as this kind of amorphous space of blues and yellows and purples, and relating it back to the title and thinking, were we thinking here in terms of looking out into a space and into a pool? Are we the ones who are Narcissus, kind of engaging with our own reflection in the work? Is this almost like a Caravaggio-esque Narcissus in which the figure is leaning over? And of course, all of this is so interesting when we think about the ways in which Frankenthaler would work on the floor, on her knees, looking into these paintings as she created them.
Absolutely, and also I find it fascinating that you've got those Floorboard series. I know she didn't actually call them Floorboard series, and then you get to something like Cape Orange on the far kind of right of that, and it's just this other experience because suddenly she's using acrylic on canvas, which almost just the colours kind of completely come at you, these kind of reds and oranges interspersed with these kind of thin lines of blue. I mean, it's just amazing the kind of different textures that you get with them. I find with the Floorboard works especially, the paint feels very kind of on the surface, but when you get to Cape Orange, it almost feels like it's always been there. There's so much kind of opaqueness to it. And I'd love to sort of go back to sort of who Frankenthaler actually was. So she was born in 1928 in New York City. Her father was a New York State Supreme Court judge. Her mother was a second-generation German immigrant. And she grew up in this amazing place. You know, it was the 30s, it was New York City. She attended Dalton School. I mean, this was also where she really began her artistic education. I mean, tell us about her education here.
Well, she has quite a difficult time at school, which I think is interesting and true to a whole number of artists who maybe don't find that they have that kind of encouragement that they need to be able to flourish. And so Dalton is, I think, the third school that she goes to. It's, of course, a very elite Upper East Side Manhattan school. And there she's really able to flourish because she is able to study with Rufino Tomeo, which for us as, you know, art historians and thinkers is a kind of slightly mind-blowing thing to think that as a teenager you would have exposure to a Mexican muralist of that stature. And it is incredible because he really drills into her a kind of craftsmanship which you then see throughout the rest of her career. So he teaches her how to stretch a canvas. He teaches her about what a fundamental mix might be for her paint. So 1/3 linseed oil, 1/3 varnish, 1/3 turpentine, and then mixing the tube pigment. So he's really getting her kind of excited about what it means to be a painter. And I think she has this sweet way in which she says, he was my first friend who was an artist. But I think he was also the first person who made her feel that she not only could be an artist, but really she should.
Yeah, my gosh, what an incredible sort of early start to your career to have that. And also, you know, she used to visit the Museum of Modern Art at that time as well. I mean, it was such a time of kind of richness and newness for that time in New York City.
And also, she lived quite close to the Met, so she would walk to the Met. And there's in an interview, she describes walking home and with, I think, some chalk or creates a line, which on the one hand is a boundary line, and on the other hand, it's kind of cartographic. But also, I think, speaks to that very precocious nature which she had, and also the privilege of being able to do that. I think her nurse is a few steps behind her, so she's kind of being taken care of, but on the one hand expressing herself within the city itself.
Yeah, absolutely. And then between 1946 and 1949, she attends Bennington College in Vermont, and again is exposed to such illustrious teaching. I mean, tell us about her experience with people like Paul Feely.
Yeah, so Paul Feely was there. It was a very bohemian and interdisciplinary institution. Howard Nemerov, the poet, was on the faculty there too. And yeah, Feely was a really important influence and teacher for her, and he worked to some ways in the Cubist tradition, thought a lot about perspective, working on still lives, and that friendship actually blossomed throughout the rest of Feely's life. And later on, at the end of her time at Bennington, she curated an exhibition of all of the girls' students' work, and managed in a very enterprising way to get Clement Greenberg to attend, because she promised both martinis and Manhattans, and was able to in a very enterprising and businesslike way get the New York art elite to visit Bennington as well, and then Greenberg and Feely would curate exhibitions later on when they visited together.
And similarly to Tomeo, she has that great passage where she talks about how, I think it's in her interview with Barbara Rose, and she says that, when she's studying there with her great friend Sonia Rudikoff, that if they were to say something in class and Feely kind of listened to it and was interesting, it would really stop him sort of partway through what he was doing. And it's that sense that already at this incredibly tender age, she's really being treated as a professional. And so she knows that her voice has meaning, has relevance, and can be part of shaping a whole kind of ecology that's at that moment very nascent in terms of the direction of post-war American art. But to be given that sense that your voice has meaning so young, that is, I think, of profound importance to her trajectory going forward.
And you see it in her paintings. I mean, just the sort of sheer scale that she's working on. The confidence was the brush so early on. I mean, she then comes to New York City. I mean, first of all, studies with people like Hans Hofmann in Provincetown. And then it's kind of, the 9th Street Show is there, and she's so young. But firstly, I mean, tell us about the early 1950s. She enters the New York art world. What is she entering into?
Well, it is about the most exciting time that you could graduate, I think. I mean, to think that she graduates from Bennington in the summer of 1949, that's the same point at which Life magazine is publishing their famous article about Jackson Pollock, slightly sardonically saying, is he the greatest living artist in America? And, then you have the founding of the club that same year, which is to be a really important space in terms of convening these different artists and discussions, as well as, of course, martinis and Manhattans. And it continues with things like Nina Lean taking the photograph for Life magazine of the Irascibles, which is then published in 51. So in this period between about 49 and 51, which is when she's graduating, then she's in Provincetown, as you say, studying with Hans Hofmann, and then she's in New York. Everything is kind of happening. And to put it in perspective in terms of the generations, she has, as you say, her first solo exhibition at Taibeh Danaj in 1951.
When she's 22 or 23.
Yeah, and that's the same year that Lee Krasner has her first solo exhibition, but she is 20 years Frankenthaler's senior. So it kind of gives you a sense as to why there was sometimes a little bit of friction between the generations, because they just hadn't had the same kind of opportunities. That older generation of artists they'd lived through the Depression, they'd literally been on the breadlines, they'd worked for the WPA, they'd been in New York in a time when there really weren't commercial galleries, there wasn't really even an art press. So when they were having exhibitions, it was often in bookshops or makeshift spaces, and there wasn't really anyone very much to even write about it. Whereas this point at which Frankenthaler bursts onto the scene, all of that is beginning to come alive. So she really comes out into New York at the best possible moment.
This is the time when she's meeting people like Frank O'Hara. I mean, who is she mixing with at this time?
Frank O'Hara was a curator and poet who worked in New York in the 1950s, and actually became a great friend of Frankenthaler, would write poetry about her works, and actually even curated her first retrospective at the Jewish Museum in 1960. In one poem, Blue Territory, which is Frankenthaler sat on in the famous Gordon Parks image. It's a very surrealist poem. All of the words seem to dart around the white page, but it's set in sand and sea, and he talks about the messness of the work being created. And I think that maybe speaks to his sense of the ways in which Frankenthaler was experimenting, on the one hand with order, that she's not a pure kind of drip painter like Pollock, practicing with order and restraint in this way through that tension and through his poetics over the course of the 50s.
And I think figures like that are just so critical to her, because I think it is important to remember that we're saying, this is an incredibly vibrant and exciting time, but it's still a time with enormous tensions about what it means to be working abstractly. That's why the irascible photograph comes out, is because they're protesting against this exhibition at the Met. And if we think of the review that comes out in the New York Times, in which they describe mountains and sea as sweet and unambitious, it is remarkable. So it was a lifeline to have someone like the poet Frank O'Hara, to be able to have those relationships with other painters. She's very close with Grace Hartigan. They needed that, to have that small, closely knit community of other artists and writers who really understood what they were getting at and what was at stake.
Totally, and it's so interesting you talk about the importance of community, because also it was the community, it was the club who actually staged the 9th Street show, where, am I right in thinking she actually installed a 7-foot painting in age 22 or something? I mean, just incredible.
Yeah, and the 9th Street show has obviously become the stuff of legends, and it's the title of Mary Gabriel's recent book, which is brilliant. And it is a kind of amazing thing to think about them all. I think there's somewhere 72, something like that, artists in the show, 11 women, which we think of very scathingly, but actually I think 11 women out of 72 for the time was pretty good going, for a moment in which women artists were still broadly thought of as a contradiction in terms. And it's fascinating that even in her diaries, Frankenthaler uses the male pronoun when she's talking about the artist. When the artist does this, should he X? It's so ingrained in people that to be an artist is a kind of masculine pursuit. But it's the club who are behind staging it, and it's in this condemned building on 9th Street, and they persuade Leo Castelli to hang the whole thing, and because they're so worried about the competition, about who's going to get to have their work exhibited where, and who's going to get which walls. And of course, Frankenthaler does this brilliantly audacious thing that they have a degree of rules about what size of painting you can have in the show. And she says, no, I'm going to be showing my 7-foot painting, and take that.
Good for her. But I mean, then the year later, in 1952, this is an absolute breakthrough moment for her, because, I mean, as demonstrated in the show downstairs, the beautiful work Untitled from 1952 is about 8 months preceding her, what is considered to be her breakthrough painting, Mountains and Sea, which is a lot of time people use that as the kind of benchmark of Frankenthaler. I mean, this is where she kind of makes this breakthrough moment where she introduces the kind of colour field painting, the soak stain technique. I mean, what is this technique? What is she doing? What is so exciting about Mountains and Sea?
It has become such a linchpin work in terms of how we think about the chronology of Frankenthaler and what her contribution was to the history of abstract expressionism. And I mean, broadly, the details are that it was made on the 26th of October, 1952, and she lays out a swatch of unstretched and unprimed canvas on the floor and decides to create this very aqueous, very light, very gestural scene. So you mentioned the Untitled work that's on display downstairs. That work is in oil as well, on primed canvas, but it's edge to edge, it's densely patterned. It's also similarly in this kind of, is it abstract vein? It gestures towards things that we might recognize, a sand dune, a pool of water, fronds, but never actually hardens into anything nameable. Whereas Mountains and Sea has this real lightness of touch, and there's these really fine arcs of graphite or pencil where she's marked out where she wanted to stain the canvas. And then the stain takes on this very sensuous and very visceral quality, actually. If we think of the canvas as being a little bit like a skin, then what it means for pigment to soak into the tooth of that skin has then a relationship to us as viewers, whereby it's very similar to how sensation sinks through our skin. So it is this remarkable painting, and of course it sets her off on the journey to come and becomes very important for artists like Kenneth Noland and Morris Lewis, who go and visit her studio in 1953. It then becomes an important part of their creative trajectory as well.
I was really interested as well with Mountains and Sea, the ways in which the date is kind of arced to the bottom of the canvas, and that sense of it kind of capturing life on the fly, that sense of marking and documenting the particular date as much as her name within the work. And Alexander Nemirov uses that diurnal kind of technique for his most recent biography, which is brilliant, and thinks about the life of Frankenthaler in the 1950s, but focusing specifically on a particular day, particular moment, particular experience, which was so transformational and maybe says much about what developed after that.
And that's part of what had struck her about Pollock's work, because of course part of her creative journey in terms of creating that painting was that she'd been to see Pollock's show at the Betty Parsons Gallery in 1951, and she'd been really struck by exactly that quality, the immediacy. And these are not the Pollocks that we maybe think of when we think of his signature style. This is not Lavender Mist. These are the black and white works in which he's using black industrial enamel paints directly onto unprimed canvas. There's a few different things that are really interesting about this. One is that broadly, the critical reaction to these works is really poor. So we sometimes talk about Frankenthaler responding to this show in a way that's suggesting that perhaps the invention of the soak stain technique doesn't entirely belong to her because, you know, she was very open about having borrowed from Pollock's techniques. But at the same time, the very fact that she was able to see something in these works at a point at which so many of the critics were basically saying that Pollock had gone off the boil and he'd lost his touch is super interesting. And I think also then when you look at those Pollock works, they're very turgid, they're very frenetic. The mark making is really agitated. And you see what she does with it. And she, first of all, introduces this incredibly lyrical palette of colour. But then she brings this other quality into it, this kind of calmness to the work that is, I think, part of why they are such striking things to stand in the midst of.
Absolutely, but I mean, also this idea when she goes to that Betty Parsons show in 1951, she talks about it being like going to Lisbon, like going to Portugal, but not being able to speak Portuguese, but actually having that curiosity to try and understand the language, try and understand the culture. I mean, it's so exciting. Also, this sort of intuitiveness, I guess, that kind of goes, you know, when we see those works downstairs, they are entitled 1958, and then the ones in the early 1960s, I mean, it's fascinating.
Absolutely, and I think that, yeah, as you say there, Katy, in terms of going to Lisbon and not knowing any Portuguese, that sense of understanding something, but with kind of almost pre-cognitively or pre-linguistically, I think was so important. And when Frankenthaler was interviewed and she talked about this really transformational moment and was told by Clement Greenberg to, you know, kind of go and sink or swim in this new space as a young adult, let's remember, she doesn't really talk about what the works look like. She talks about process. And I think that was really important for her in thinking through taking the canvas off the easel, putting it on the floor, engaging with it all around. And at the same time, that acknowledgement of influence was particularly, I think, important when we think about Noland, and that sense that it was really important for her to talk about the origin, or not an origin, but a beginning of sorts going to that exhibition, and that kind of lineage which is then followed later on by those artists who acknowledge their own debt to her.
You mentioned at the beginning the so-called floorboard paintings, which, you know, she didn't call as such, but they're works in which she felt she'd been working directly on the floor, as she did really from that point of making Mountains and Sea through the rest of her career. And she felt like the canvas was becoming a little bit overworked, over kind of laden. And then she turned them over and saw on the reverse that the staining, which had picked up on it the marks of the grain of the floorboards, that she actually really liked what was happening on the underneath. And there's a few different things I find so interesting about that. I mean, one is that relationship to accident and chance, which really lives with her throughout her career, that she has this very kind of expansive embrace of the ways in which incident might occur in the studio space and really trying to cultivate that. So the fact that she says that this reverse is actually now the thing she's more interested in. But I was thinking about what you were saying about almost precognitive understanding of language, because the flip side of a painting is almost like the underside of an eyelid. You know, it's trying to get at imagery that might exist somewhere within yourself without necessarily being you looking out onto the world. And if we think about an artist's relationship to the easel, when we look at a painting that's been painted on an easel, we stand where the artist once stood, and we have this very straight relationship and equivalence. When we look at a painting that's been painted on the floor, and we can literally see the floorboards, notionally, we are then lying on the floor looking up at this thing. So it does something really interesting to your body and to your relationship to it as a piece. And I think much of this is really subtle. So I've been really excited to see different friends coming to see this exhibition, some of whom are not at all art world people and don't have any relationship to Frankenthaler, but are really able to relate to some of those ideas because they're very subtle and impossible not to kind of feel or respond to.
Totally. I mean, that's so fascinating as well. I think also the reason why I was so drawn to Cape Orange especially was because it was almost this kind of door frame-like, and I couldn't really understand the perspective of it. It's so disorientated. And I think she said maybe in the 80s, she talks about how, assuming that you know nothing about painting at all when she's taking the canvas off the easel and on the floor, and actually you feel like that going into the exhibition. It's like nothing you've ever seen before with Frankenthaler. It's completely different. But I'm also fascinated by what you were saying earlier in terms of her not actually being able to describe her paintings. And I know so many people have sort of tried to do that over the years as well. And this fascinating moment in 1958 where she visits France and Spain with Motherwell, I think it's their honeymoon, and she kind of talks about this idea of kind of being in the caves, in the landscape. I mean, can you expand on this?
Yeah, sure. So Frankenthaler and Motherwell go on the honeymoon, as you say, to France and Spain, and they go to the caves in Altamira, and thinking through these Paleolithic drawings and paintings of bison and horses and cows kind of on the ceiling. And again, that feeling of the space of the art being kind of looking up to it rather than looking ahead. And it being also a total environment of art. Motherwell notes on that moment that the bison and the horses and everyone were dancing as they were within the candlelight. And I think that was a really important moment for both artists in terms of their productivity and thinking about space, thinking about history, and thinking about their own place within representation and abstraction.
It's one of the great lines of Motherwell that if a painting doesn't make human contact, it's worth nothing. And I always think that is like such a thrill of connection between the two of them, that their painting practices in many ways are very distinct, but they share that sense that it needs to make human contact.
And also it being, the honeymoon was very much a working holiday as well. I think that's important to note, and they were noted because there was the New American Painting exhibition in Madrid while they were relatively close by. And of course, that was the moment when Motherwell's elegies were not exhibited, were not able to be exhibited unless they were forced to be changed their name on the grounds of Franco's disdain for them as a representation of the Republican movement. And there's a wonderful postcard that Frankenthaler sends where she's saying, they're going to arrest us, but we'll be in the Ritz making our work. They'll probably arrest us for that too. So there's this kind of wonderful moment there of them being co-conspirators politically, artistically, and at the beginning of their marriage.
And so in 1957, Gordon Parks takes this incredible picture of Helen Frankenthaler that you mentioned earlier, sitting on blue territory. I mean, totally how almost we're meant to experience her painting, being totally disorientated. I mean, can you tell us about this?
Well, it is an incredible image, and it's an image that has really become synonymous with Frankenthaler's practice. So it's actually not an article that's just about Frankenthaler. It's looking at a number of women artists at that time who are considered to be ascendant. And Frankenthaler is sat very demurely with her legs tucked underneath her, and she sat on top of this painting. And I think it's safe to presume that she probably collaborated with Parks on the whole framing of this image. She has mountains and sea behind her. So as you say, it's as if she's immersed herself in this kind of fish tank of painting. And so it really kind of wraps around her. And there's even this kind of synergy between her wearing this quite scarlet lipstick and this little stain of red against mountain and sea. So it's a fantastically arresting image, and it's not a surprise that it's become the cover image for the new Nemiroff book. But it's also an image that I imagine has kind of, haunted her in the years to come as well, in the same way that Hedda Stern, later in her life, was furious about being the only woman in the Irascibles picture, the Nina Lean's photograph that I mentioned earlier, because she was like, all anyone ever talks to me about is that one goddamn photograph.
She was the only woman.
Yeah, exactly.
Up
so
high.
I suspect it was something of a poisoned chalice. And I think it's also interesting because one of the things that I think makes Frankenthaler's paintings so compelling to look at today was also precisely what she was sometimes criticized for at the time, which is they give this impression of being quite effortless, maybe partly because of the way in which these washes sort of operate on the canvas, and the fact that there can be a real lightness of touch to their making. But if we think of, Grace Hartigan once quite bitchily said that they looked like paintings that had been made between cocktails and dinner. And Larry Rivers, after her second Tiber Donage show, similarly writes and says, maybe you are more tortured than these paintings look. Maybe doubt does come at you too. But it might be a good idea to cultivate this within your work, because at that time there was such a kind of equivalence drawn between the idea that a painting needed to be kind of wrestled out of yourself. So I think one of the things that's so interesting about that Parks image is there she is sat so demurely and so confidently within these paintings, which she knows have been critiqued for their very elegance, and yet she kind of really holds her own in that space.
But it's so interesting, that Parks image, because like we were talking earlier, you mentioned, Matthew, about how she's sitting on blue territory, and Frank O'Hara responded to that work. Am I right in thinking that?
Absolutely, and yeah, O'Hara writes very eloquently, I think, on Frankenthaler's practice. And again, going back to that poem that earlier on we were talking about messness, but actually I remember that what happens just before is it's desire is the father of messness. So there's this kind of enjambment, this break, desire, and then there's this sense of it being desire is the origin of the work, this kind of patrilineal way of understanding it. But of course it's broken, it's quite violently broken, its masculinity is quite confused. O'Hara writing as a gay man on Frankenthaler's practice. I think that there's quite a lot there in terms of trying to understand her work and the history of her place within the history of abstract expressionism through those poetics. And later on, O'Hara in the 1960 Jewish Museum show talks about how Frankenthaler risks the big gesture, and again that balance between order and restraint and chance and the aleatory. I think that was really important, not only for a painterly embodiment of his own poetics, but a way in which to understand her work as it matures into the 60s.
Absolutely, because also this is so interesting, the fact that we go downstairs and we see works like Rubens or something, and already she's entering into a different part of her career completely. I mean, just the difference between Mountain and Sea and Rubens or something, 10 years, and all of a sudden she's maturing so much. And you mentioned she's already having an exhibition at the Jewish Museum in 1960, curated by Frank O'Hara. I mean, this is incredible. She's getting so much recognition. Where do you think this recognition and mature career is now taking her with these 60s paintings?
Like for many artists, that Jewish Museum show is really critical because it gives her an opportunity to sort of reflect on what's come before and really think about where she wants to be moving next. So we see downstairs that there's a very particular character to those paintings from 1961. They're very graphic. They have, a slightly calligraphic element to them in terms of their use of line. They're using black and darker colours in sort of interesting ways. And there's a lot of untouched canvas within them as well. So they're incredibly bold in that use of negative space. And there's probably a parallel there to thinking about some of those poems that also likewise play with the kind of blankness of the page. And I think she was rare, actually, in being an artist at that time who had that kind of opportunity to be able to look at her work. And of course that would come again in 69 with the Whitney show, which is then what travels here to the Whitechapel Gallery, and is the last major moment when we had to be able to appreciate her painting here.
And her links to London are quite extensive as well, particularly during that period. Friends and shown by Casmin Gallery as well here in London, and a great friendship with Anthony Caro. And they, Frankenthaler spent some time in his old piano factory studio in Camden Town and produced these really extraordinary sculptures from welded steel and found materials. And they were the first sculptures that that she made, and she made them here.
Yeah, I love that relationship between them, because am I right in thinking that Caro came to New York, Helen follows up, and then in 1972 comes to London. And what's incredible about seeing that sculpture in Davy Street and this exhibition and the Tate show is seeing so much kind of intuitiveness as well with her work. I mean, the way that she's approaching sculpture is so free. I mean, you can almost see those kind of synergies between the painting and the sculpture in a way.
The idea of freedom, I think, is fascinating within her work and goes hand in hand very much with that confidence as well, because, you know, there's a lot of risk-taking involved in the kind of work that she's doing, and it doesn't all work out. And, you know, I like the fact that sometimes she would work directly on the floor on a painting, and then she'd decide that the composition wasn't quite resolving in the way she wanted, and she would literally cut it in two and take it into two different paintings. You know, so she had this very robust attitude to what she was making, and was very experimental. So likewise, the woodcuts that she makes later in her career. And, you know, she's kind of up for that constantly sort of shifting direction and working in another vein and seeing what that might yield for her.
It was so unusual, though, but incredible that she was getting all this recognition. You know, she was one of 4 artists who participated in the 1966 Venice Biennale representing America. Then she had her huge retrospective in '69 at the Whitney. And then comes this amazing moment in the 70s, and obviously this is the birth of the feminist movement. Yet she's not so involved in it. I mean, this is quite an interesting kind of apolitical stand towards this movement, do you think?
I think she is adverse to the idea of being ghettoised, and a number of women of her stature feel similarly. So, you know, Krasner is maybe a little bit more warm towards the feminist movement, but she also says it arrived far too late to be able to ameliorate the conditions in which I was working. You know, so Frankenthaler really, I think, both understands that it's a movement that is maybe not going to directly affect her. She doesn't necessarily need it to directly affect her because she is getting the critical recognition that she needs, but also that she doesn't necessarily want to be ghettoized as a woman painter. She wants to be allowed to stand as a painter with no adjectives needed to qualify that status.
I mean, I think of her as a giant in contemporary art, yet, like you say, we haven't seen these works in the flesh in decades. Why do you think there is so much interest in her work now for the 21st century audience?
Well, maybe one way to answer this question perhaps is to look at Alexander Nemirov's most recent biography, which is a fascinating study of this decade of the 1950s. In it, he talks about his own path, his own career, the ways in which, as a child of postmodernism and believing that art should serve a kind of a social purpose in the 1980s and so on, that actually abstract expressionism and the beauty and the elegance of Frankenthaler's paintings, well, it's embarrassing, right? It's somehow too earnest. It's somehow too sure of itself and somehow not serving political purposes. But what he does so beautifully, I think, in the beginning of that biography is think through what do we want art to be? And actually, there is a place for earnestness. There is a place for gesture. There is a place for taking art seriously on its own terms. And I think that perhaps there's a bit of fatigue of understanding art in a particular way, and actually returning to artists like Frankenthaler allows us to think through art afresh, and not perhaps nostalgically, but in a new way.
I think it's a really exciting moment. I mean, I think that's an incredibly important point about that idea of embarrassment, and where have we come from that? And there is so much critical work still to be done. So, for instance, on this question of do we consider Frankenthaler political? Most people would say a kind of downright no. She probably would have said a downright no. But I think it depends a lot on how we determine the word political. So obviously, you know, there were periods when abstract expressionism broadly fell out of favour because by comparison to institutional critique or video art or conceptualism or, you know, lots of these movements, it felt very kind of wan or thin in its substance or its political engagement. And that's probably partly because these are artists who had seen a period of socialist realism, or had kind of certainly witnessed the legacy of that and the idea that that kind of work could be very stiff and very didactic. But I think one of the points that's so important in the Nemirov book is the idea that, you know, Frankenthaler is an artist who was taught by Erich Fromm at Bennington, you know, who's this great sociologist and psychologist talking about the power of freedom. Like, what does it mean for an individual to be able to experience the sensuousness of freedom. And that, for me, is deeply political. And if you create a painting that empowers a person to understand their own physical agency, you create something that's entirely a political act.